The flashing red and blue lights painted the quiet street as a police cruiser sat behind a sleek, black luxury car. The officer, his jaw tight with frustration, banged his fist against the driver's side window. "License and registration, now!" Officer Brian Walker demanded, his tone sharp, his patience already worn thin. Inside the car, a black woman sat calmly, her hands resting on the wheel. She didn't look nervous or guilty, just annoyed. "Officer, may I ask why I've been stopped?" she asked evenly. Walker's eyes narrowed. A black woman in this kind of car? It didn't sit right with him. She had to be up to something. "Step out of the vehicle," he snapped. As she reached for her ID, his anger flared. Before she could react, he grabbed her wrist, tight, forceful. That was his mistake. Because in just a few minutes, he would realize the woman he just put his hands on was his boss. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from. And if you believe in justice, hit that like button and subscribe for more powerful stories. Officer Brian Walker tightened his grip on the woman's wrist, his knuckles turning white. The luxury car's interior lights cast a soft glow on her calm but firm expression. She didn't flinch, didn't panic. She simply held his stare. "Take your hands off me," she said. Her voice controlled but unwavering. Walker didn't budge. His instincts told him to show dominance. He'd done this plenty of times before, pulling over drivers who didn't belong in high-end cars, treating them like suspects before even knowing their names. "I said, step out of the vehicle," he barked again, yanking the door open. The woman sighed and slowly moved, careful to keep her hands visible. She knew how these situations could go horribly wrong. The cold night air brushed against her skin as she stepped out, her heels clicking softly against the pavement. She stood tall, her posture exuding quiet authority. "Turn around and place your hands on the car," Walker ordered, reaching for his cuffs. "For what reason?" she asked, arching an eyebrow. Walker scoffed. "Driving a car like this? Dressed like that? You tell me." The woman's expression didn't change, but her silence made Walker uneasy. The air around them felt charged. The few bystanders nearby had stopped to watch, sensing that something wasn't right. The woman Walker had just manhandled was Naomi Carter, chief of police, 42 years old, sharp-minded, respected across the force. The first black female chief of police in the state, had spent decades fighting for justice, both inside and outside the system. Currently returning from a police leadership conference when she was stopped. She wasn't someone who lost her cool easily, but being profiled and manhandled by her own officer. This was going to be a long night. Officer Brian Walker had been on the force for years. 38 years old, cocky and aggressive with power. Believes in law and order, but only for certain people. Has a history of profiling minorities, but has never faced consequences. Sees himself as a strong officer who keeps the streets clean. He wasn't nervous yet. He still believed he was in control. A dimly lit road leading out of the city. Expensive neighborhoods nearby where officers like Walker rarely saw black drivers. The flashing police lights bounced off the dark pavement, creating a tense atmosphere. A small group of bystanders had started watching from a distance. Naomi glanced at the officer's badge. She recognized his name instantly. Brian Walker. She had read reports about him before. Excessive force complaints, unjustified stops, never formally disciplined. But tonight, that was going to change. She inhaled deeply. "I suggest you let me go before you do something you regret." Walker chuckled, shaking his head. "I don't take orders from criminals." Naomi's expression remained calm. "We'll see about that." Walker reached for his cuffs. Naomi narrowed her eyes, and at that moment, the sound of another police siren filled the air. More officers were arriving, And very soon, Brian Walker would realize the woman he was trying to arrest was the person who could end his career. The sharp wail of another police siren echoed through the night, its flashing lights approaching fast. Officer Brian Walker barely acknowledged it. He was too focused on controlling the situation. "Hands on the car, now!" he barked again, gripping the cuffs in his hands. Naomi Carter didn't move. She stood tall, her eyes locked onto his. There was no fear in her expression, only a cold, unwavering confidence. "You still haven't told me what crime I committed," she said evenly. Walker's patience snapped. "I don't need to explain myself to you. I know exactly what you're doing, acting like you're above the law." Naomi let out a slow breath. "I know the law better than you do, Officer Walker." His fingers tightened around her arm. His grip was strong, almost bruising. But before he could pull her forward, a voice from behind him cut through the air. "Let her go." Walker turned sharply, his jaw clenched. Standing beside the patrol car was Lieutenant Mark Reynolds, his superior. His face was set in a deep frown, his arms crossed over his chest. Behind him, 2 more officers had just arrived. Walker felt his heart rate spike. Walker hesitated, his grip on Naomi loosening just slightly. "What's going on here?" Reynolds asked, his sharp gaze moving between the two. Walker quickly straightened. "I pulled her over for suspicious behavior, sir. She refused to follow my orders, and she was resisting arrest." Naomi raised an eyebrow. "Is that what you're calling this?" Walker ignored her, focusing on his superior. "She wouldn't even give me her name." A small, almost amused smile flickered across Naomi's face. "You never asked." Reynolds exhaled through his nose, his irritation clear. He stepped closer, his eyes landing on Naomi properly for the first time. And then his expression changed. Walker noticed. "Sir?" he asked, confused. But Reynolds wasn't looking at him anymore. His face went pale. "Chief Carter," Reynolds said slowly, his voice tinged with disbelief. What are you doing here?" Walker's stomach dropped. "Chief," he echoed, blinking rapidly. Naomi let the title hang in the air for a moment. Then she calmly reached into her pocket and pulled out her badge. The gold emblem of Chief of Police gleamed under the streetlights. Walker felt like he had been punched in the gut. Gasps rippled through the small crowd of bystanders who had gathered. "Wait, she's the chief?" someone whispered. That officer was harassing his own boss? One man shook his head. "Oh, he's done." Walker's face burned. His entire body went rigid. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. He had just physically grabbed the chief of police. He had profiled her, insulted her, accused her of resisting arrest. And now, everyone was watching. Walker immediately loosened his grip on her arm, stepping back as if he hadn't just assaulted his own boss. "Chief, I didn't recognize you," he stammered. "This was all just a misunderstanding." Naomi tilted her head slightly, examining him like he was an insect under a microscope. "Oh, now it's a misunderstanding," she said, voice smooth as ice. "Because a moment ago, you were ready to throw me in handcuffs." Walker opened his mouth, but no words came out. Reynolds sighed heavily, rubbing his forehead. "Officer Walker, step away from Chief Carter, now." Walker swallowed hard, his hands now shaking. This wasn't supposed to happen. The people he usually stopped never had power. But Naomi Carter, she had more power than anyone on that street. And he was about to find out exactly what that meant. Officer Brian Walker's breath felt heavy in his chest. Just moments ago, he had been certain that he was in control, certain that he was dealing with just another black driver who didn't belong in a luxury car. But now, as Lieutenant Reynolds barked at him to step away, his world tilted. The woman he had just manhandled, accused, and nearly arrested. She was his boss. Walker took a slow step back, his hands trembling slightly. Naomi Carter held his gaze, unshaken. The streetlights reflected off her polished badge as she slipped it back into her jacket, but she didn't need to flash her title. Everyone knew exactly who she was now. "Chief Carter," Reynolds said, shifting uncomfortably. I'm so sorry about this. Had we known—" Naomi lifted a hand, stopping him. "Had you known," she repeated, voice calm but sharp. Her eyes flicked back to Walker. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. "So, Officer Walker," she said, stepping forward, "I want you to explain to me, right here, in front of everyone, why did you pull me over?" Walker shifted his weight uncomfortably. His mind raced for a way out of this, but the weight of the watching eyes, the crowd, his superior officers, even his own partner, made it impossible to think. I thought you looked suspicious," he muttered. Naomi arched a brow. "Suspicious? How exactly?" Walker's lips pressed into a tight line. He knew what she was doing, forcing him to admit the truth. "You were in an expensive car, alone at night, in an area where—" He hesitated. "Where what?" Naomi pressed. Walker's face burned. He knew what he wanted to say, but he also knew that saying it would seal his fate. "Where people like me don't belong." Naomi finished for him. The crowd murmured. Walker's face drained of color. Naomi let his silence hang in the air before speaking again. "Let's walk through this, Officer Walker." Her voice was steady, commanding, as though she were leading a briefing at headquarters. "You saw a black woman driving a high-end vehicle, and without cause, you assumed she was committing a crime." Walker's jaw tightened. "That's not what You accused me of resisting arrest, even though I complied with every demand." Walker stayed silent. "You grabbed me before I even had a chance to present my identification." A wave of realization hit Walker's face. Everything she was saying, it was all true. Naomi took another step forward, lowering her voice just enough to make the moment more personal. "Tell me, Officer Walker, if I were a white man in this car, dressed in this same suit, would you have acted the same way?" Walker felt his stomach drop. He knew the answer. Everyone did. The silence was damning. Lieutenant Reynolds rubbed his temples, his frustration evident. "Walker, do you even understand what you've done tonight?" "Sir, No," Reynolds snapped. "I don't want excuses. I don't want lies. You just laid your hands on the highest-ranking officer in this department. You racial profiled the chief of police on a public street in front of witnesses. And worst of all, this isn't even the first time you've done something like this." Walker's chest tightened. "That's enough," Naomi said smoothly, lifting a hand. Everyone turned back to her. "I could have you arrested for assault right now," she stated plainly, watching Walker's Adam's apple bob as he swallowed hard. "I could fire you on the spot, but instead, I want you to do something else for me." Walker felt a flicker of hope. Maybe he could talk his way out of this. "Anything, Chief," he said quickly. Naomi's expression didn't soften. "I want you to look me in the eye and admit why you really stopped me tonight." Walker's breath hitched. The crowd leaned in. His lips parted, but no words came out. Naomi tilted her head. "Go on." He felt suffocated. The truth sat on the edge of his tongue, heavy and inescapable. "Because you're black," he finally muttered, barely above a whisper. Naomi nodded slowly. "Louder, officer." Walker's eyes darted around. His career, his reputation, everything. It was crumbling. "Because you're black," he repeated, voice tight. The crowd erupted in gasps. A few people shook their heads in disgust. Naomi let the moment stretch, forcing Walker to sit with the weight of his own words. "Now, tell me again," she said. "Who doesn't belong here?" Walker couldn't answer. Lieutenant Reynolds turned to Walker, his jaw set. "Hand over your badge." Walker's blood ran cold. "Sir, please, now." Walker's hands shook as he unpinned his badge, placing it in Reynolds' outstretched palm. Naomi took a deep breath, finally exhaling the frustration that had been building all night. "Officer Walker, you are suspended effective immediately, pending an internal investigation," Reynolds announced. "We'll be looking into every complaint ever filed against you." Walker's legs felt weak. The weight of his past was finally crashing down on him. Naomi turned to him one last time. "Tonight, you learned something," she said. "That badge on your chest doesn't make you untouchable. And people like me? We belong wherever we want to be." Walker couldn't argue, because for the first time in his career, he had to face the truth. Officer Brian Walker stood frozen, his badge now resting in Lieutenant Reynolds' firm grip. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on him like a boulder. Just moments ago, he was in control. Now, he was the one being stripped of power. Chief Naomi Carter watched him carefully. She had seen officers like Walker before, men who believed their badge made them invincible. But tonight, he had been forced to admit the truth in front of witnesses. Still, she wasn't finished yet. "Lieutenant, get Internal Affairs on the phone," Naomi said, her tone cool but firm. Reynolds nodded, already pulling out his phone. Walker's stomach dropped even further. "Wait," he stammered, his voice shaking. "You don't have to do this. I can change." Naomi tilted her head slightly. "Change?" she echoed. "Funny how it only happens when you're caught." Walker's mind raced. He wasn't just facing a suspension. He knew what came next. Every misconduct report, every complaint was going to be re-examined. Every person he had harassed, mistreated, or profiled could now come forward. And worst of all, the department wasn't going to cover for him this time. His arrogance had always kept him safe. Not anymore. Naomi turned to Reynolds. "How many complaints has he had?" Reynolds hesitated, then sighed. 12, all dismissed." The crowd murmured in shock. 12? Someone whispered. Naomi folded her arms. "And let me guess, they were all black or brown civilians?" Reynolds nodded grimly. Walker felt like the ground was slipping beneath him. He had thought this would blow over, but instead, it was getting worse by the second. "Chief, please," Walker said, desperation creeping into his voice. "I made a mistake, but I've been a cop for 10 years. This job is my life." Naomi didn't blink. "And how many lives have you ruined in those 10 years?" Walker's chest tightened. I never hurt anyone," he insisted. Naomi scoffed. "Maybe not physically. But how many people have you humiliated? How many were arrested for no reason? How many walked away from a traffic stop feeling less than human?" Walker had no response, because deep down, he knew she was right. Reynolds' phone buzzed. He checked the screen and looked back at Naomi. "Internal Affairs wants to meet first thing in the morning," he said. Walker's stomach flipped. He could already see it. His name on the news, his career in flames. Naomi studied him for a long moment. "You want to know what makes this even worse, Officer Walker?" she finally said. Walker hesitated, then slowly nodded. Naomi exhaled through her nose, shaking her head. "I was the one who approved your last promotion." Walker's face drained of color. The crowd gasped. Naomi continued. "I saw the complaints. I read the reports. But I believed in second chances. I thought maybe you just needed better leadership. Turns out, I was wrong." Walker's knees nearly buckled. The same woman he had profiled tonight was the one who had saved his career before. And now, She was the one taking it away. Naomi turned to Reynolds. "Take him in." Walker's mouth fell open in shock. "Wait, you're arresting me. You assaulted the chief of police. Consider yourself lucky it's not worse." The metal click of handcuffs snapped through the air. Walker wasn't in control anymore. For the first time in his career, he was the one being taken away. The cold metal of the handcuffs clamped around Officer Brian Walker's wrists. He had slapped them onto countless people before, but this time, they were on him. Naomi Carter watched as Reynolds led Walker toward the patrol car. The same officer who had tried to dominate her just minutes ago now looked small, defeated. "Take him to the station," Naomi instructed. "Make sure Internal Affairs gets a full report." Walker jerked his arms. "This is a mistake. I don't deserve this." Naomi raised an eyebrow. "How many people have said that to you?" Walker's mouth snapped shut. He had lost count. The moment Walker was placed inside the squad car, the weight of his actions finally hit him. The crowd still lingered, watching him like he was just another criminal. The irony was suffocating. A week ago, he would have walked away from this stop without a scratch. A month ago, his victims wouldn't have been believed. A year ago, his complaints would have been ignored. But today, he was being held accountable. His badge gone. His reputation ruined. His career over. And the woman he had profiled. She was the one who took it all away. Inside the police station, news of Walker's arrest spread fast. Officers whispered in the hallways. Some shook their heads in shock. Others, especially black and minority officers, felt a long overdue sense of justice. By morning, Chief Naomi Carter stood at a podium addressing the press. "Last night, an officer of this department violated every principle of justice we stand for," she said, her voice firm. "He acted on bias, he abused his power, and he was held accountable. This is not just about one bad cop. This is about a culture that allows officers like him to thrive." Cameras flashed. The public was listening. As of today, Officer Brian Walker has been officially terminated. And moving forward, we will be taking steps to ensure this never happens again. A reporter raised his hand. "Chief Carter, what kind of changes can we expect?" Naomi exhaled. "More training, more oversight, and most importantly, zero tolerance for racial profiling. If you abuse your power, you will lose it." A murmur of approval spread through the crowd, because for too long, that promise had been empty. But tonight, things were different. Sitting in an interrogation room, Walker fidgeted in his chair. The walls felt too small, too suffocating. The door opened, and Naomi Carter stepped inside. She didn't sit. She just looked at him. "I want you to remember this moment," she said. Walker's throat felt dry. "The fear you feel right now, that powerlessness, that's how countless innocent people have felt under your authority." Walker looked down at the table. "I can't change what happened," he muttered. "No, but you could have changed long before it got to this," she replied. Walker had nothing left to say. Naomi shook her head. "The system let you slide for years. But today, that ended, and with that, she walked away, leaving him to sit in the consequences of his own actions. Back at home, Naomi Carter sat on her couch watching the evening news. Walker's firing was making headlines. The department's reforms were being publicly praised. And most importantly, people were finally paying attention. She let out a slow breath. One corrupt officer was gone. But the fight, it wasn't over. Because for every Walker exposed, there were more just like him still out there. And as chief of police, she wasn't stopping any time soon. Naomi stared at her badge for a moment, running her thumb over the polished surface. Being a black woman in law enforcement wasn't easy. She had to work twice as hard. She had to be twice as careful. She had to fight against both criminals and corruption. But tonight, she proved that change was possible. She clipped her badge back onto her uniform and stood up. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. Naomi Carter stood in front of her office window, gazing at the city below. The flashing news ticker on a nearby building displayed the headline, "Racist Cop Fired After Assaulting Police Chief. Department Announces Major Reforms." She took a deep breath. Tonight had been a victory, but the fight for justice was far from over. Being a leader meant holding people accountable, even those in uniform. It meant standing against corruption, prejudice, and abuse of power. And tonight, she sent a message loud and clear. If you abuse your badge, you will lose it. If you profile innocent people, you will be exposed. If you think power makes you untouchable, you are wrong. Naomi picked up her phone and sent a single text to her team. Tomorrow, we start the real work. She turned off the lights, walking out of her office with one goal in mind: change. What do you think about this story? Have you ever witnessed or experienced racial profiling? What do you think should happen to officers who abuse their power? How can law enforcement be improved? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you believe in justice, accountability, and equality, hit that like button, share this story, and subscribe for more eye-opening content. Because these stories need to be told. See you in the next one.